The Byte Show is listener supported at thebyteshow.com.
Hello, everybody. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes, and this is The Byte Show. And we're really blessed to have Joseph P. Farrell with us. Dr. Farrell, reach his website at GizaDeathStar.com, and there is a PayPal button there. Make use of it. And tonight we are into the magic of social engineering number 7. And this ought to be very interesting. Hi, Joseph.
Hi, GeorgeAnn. Thank you for having me back, and thank you for that mention of the donation button. I truly do want to thank everybody for all the comments and support and the donations. I've been slammed yet again in this last week with even more stuff to do and research and so I just wanted to thank everybody for their help and to kind of make a plea to please keep doing so. I am trying desperately to hold things together and get all these all these projects. I 2 weeks ago it was 3 major projects, and now it's up to 7 at the same time. So,
oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's the curve keeps going up rather steeply, I'm afraid, and I'm trying desperately to juggle time and resources and finances and time and resources. The endless cycle that happens when you're in this sort of research. But I do want to thank people for their support and especially that dear lady that you know who you are and all the others for their prayers and everything. It means a lot to me right now.
Well, you're very gracious. And we appreciate you, Joseph.
No, thank you.
And the volumes of work that you've done have really helped shape a lot of thinking, very advanced thinking.
Well, I hope so.
Yes. And tonight we're going to talk somewhat about education.
Right. Well, we've been doing this series on social engineering.
Yes.
And if we stop and think, the most obvious, there are 2 very obvious ways of social engineering in the soft form. And by the soft form, I mean techniques of the manipulation of perception. We've talked in previous sessions about various aspects of perception management.
Yes.
And of course, that is an old staple of intelligence agencies when they are wanting to direct people's perceptions or interpretations of events or things into certain channels.
Yeah.
But when you get right down to it, the 2 most prevalent soft techniques of perception management are twofold. There are 2 of them, and they've been around an awfully long time. And one is, of course, religion.
Yes.
And the other is, of course, education. And in modern times, I'm particularly concerned, as I think you probably are, and a bunch of the listeners, in that within the United States particularly, education seems to be totally failing. And there have been those in recent years and decades that have argued that this is in part by deliberate design. In other words, they're deliberately attempting to manage perceptions, to dumb down the general public, to create an inability to think about things and connect dots and think critically. And to a certain extent, I think that's quite true.
Yes.
You can begin this whole exploration. And again, other researchers have done an enormous amount on this whole subject, so I'm not saying anything terribly new in this respect. But you can begin this whole quest or understanding of education as a form of social engineering back with the German psychologist Wilhelm Wundt, W-U-N-D-T. And basically his approach was rather like the later Russian psychologist Pavlov, that mankind is essentially a mechanism. It's a very materialist view. That mankind, that humanity, the human person is essentially a mechanism responding to certain stimuli and then giving certain responses. And of course everybody knows Pavlov's dogs. Well, Wundt really kind of took this a step further. He attempted to make all of education a kind of a scientific input-output mass assembly line type of system, all right? And one of his most influential disciples in this country was, of course, John Dewey.
Yes.
Dewey's influence and effect on education is felt to this day, and in my opinion, in two very key respects, and I think that they play directly to this theme of social engineering that we've been talking about or trying to pursue in this series.
Yes.
The first of them is that Dewey essentially set up the framework for what I believe was the creation of a new discipline, and in my opinion, it's a pseudo-discipline. In other words, it's not a genuine academic discipline in and of itself. It's kind of a mixture of other disciplines, and that discipline, of course, is called education. It's from that whole scientific outlook that we began the process in this country of certifying teachers to be able to teach. And to me, this is always kind of stuck in my craw. You know, I have a PhD from the oldest university in the English-speaking world.
Yes.
And yet I cannot go into a public school system, a high school, and teach history without a certificate in a bunch of education theory, which in my teaching experience, GeorgeAnn, I ran across many, many students that were majoring, unquote, in education. And in my college teaching days, I was struck by the fact that they knew so little about the subjects that they were eventually going to teach, but they knew a whole lot about how to teach them. Okay. In other words, the emphasis shifted from the content to the form, to the actual method of teaching itself, and that's what began to stick in my craw. Well, why is that the case? The second thing that I think Dewey's influence has championed in this country particularly is the idea of standardized tests and the assignment of a numerical value, essentially a scalar, if you want to get right down to it, which is nothing but a number or numerical value to a person's intellectual and educational aptitude. All right? And this is manifest in all of those standardized tests that we have taken as students ever since our days in elementary school, with the Iowa tests of basic skills, all the way up through high school to the SATs, the ACTs, and then, specialized versions of all of these standardized tests that have multiplied like rabbits since then.
Yes.
All under the control, incidentally, of a private educational monopoly that administers these tests. Okay? A corporation, in other words. And what interests me in terms of the social engineering aspect of it is that if you sit down, for example, and I was thinking about this tonight in trying to prepare for this little talk, if we were to encounter a history examination on one of those standardized tests, of course it would be a set of multiple questions. You'd get 4 or 5 answers to fill in your little blacken in your oval with your number 2 lead pencil as to which answer is the correct answer or the best answer.
Yeah.
But it suddenly occurred to me is if you were to ask a person on that test, who killed John F. Kennedy? All right? Well, you might get a selection of answers, but the correct answer would, of course, be Lee Harvey Oswald. All right?
Mm-hmm.
Or you might get a question, when and where did Adolf Hitler die?
Yeah.
Well, again, the correct answer on these tests would be he died on April 30th, committing suicide in the bunker in Berlin. All right?
Yeah.
Okay? Now here's the problem, and it's immediately evident, particularly in the application of these standardized tests to the so-called soft disciplines like history or English or French literature or, something like that. In other words, the disciplines that require a great deal of thought and a great deal of familiarity with the actual facts and investigations of each of these things. But in point of fact, what you find being managed in these standardized tests are precisely people's perceptions. In other words, you're expected to regurgitate an answer.
Yes.
According to a standard academic model or interpretation of history or the development of the English language or the German language or what have you.
Yeah.
So in other words, you're never going to find on these tests a question regarding alternative views of those events. Most people in this country are profoundly skeptical of the official explanation, the Warren Commission report explanation for the assassination of President Kennedy. And yet, you will find that viewpoint is embodied in standardized tests. By the same token, there are many people that have, including myself, deep suspicions about the suicide of Hitler in Berlin. I'm increasingly of the view that he may have actually made it out of continental Europe alive and well at the end of World War II. But you will not find alternative views of this sort encapsulated or mentioned in these standardized tests. So in other words, education itself and the very form of standardization that we've been pursuing in this country since the late 19th century with Dewey and the influence of Wilhelm Wundt on American education. The very form of education that we have been pursuing is precisely a form of perception management. And this I find deeply disturbing, because in effect what it means is that when you're taking these standardized tests, you have no opportunity or no means available to present or argue, and that's the key word, present and argue, any alternative point of view. The answers are pre-selected for you by, and here's the key crucial point, pre-selected for you by a kind of a self-appointed educational elite.
Yes.
And the answers have really nothing to do with the profound study of any of the disciplines that they're concerned with. They have only to do with whether or not you know the answer of the standard model that they're seeking to promote. And that's the problem.
Yes, absolutely correct. Oh, yeah.
And in that, this is why I raise the connection to religion. Because, again, in religion you have a certain, regardless of what particular religion you may be thinking of, you have a certain standard set of or stock answers to certain situations, to certain doctrines, to certain things that by the nature of the case must be adhered to, or otherwise you are no longer an adherent of that religion. So in other words, we're looking at more or less the same sort of phenomenon of perception management that I think is very deleterious. And we're seeing the results right now with an inability of people, particularly in this country, to focus on anything that they see on the news in any sort of deep way. In fact, they've so eviscerated the human habit of curiosity to examine things and to examine them deeply and think for themselves that it does not bode well for the future. And this is my big problem with education and the educational establishment now, because I think all they are masters of perception management.
Very well stated, Joseph. And how true.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness. Well, I remember many, many years ago, I took one of these tests.
Yes.
And it came back that I didn't understand what I was reading.
Yeah.
And It wasn't that I didn't understand. It was that I didn't agree with the damn answers.
Exactly. Well, let me give you an example. I have a friend, and I actually kind of hope that you'll be able to interview him, because he is right now a professional in the field of education,
yes.
In the field of English. And again, like me, his background is as a PhD from the University of Oxford. And this man has set state benchmarks for the subject of education in the state of California. In other words, he's at the very top of performance evaluation of professional teachers.
Yes.
And yet, the system is so set up that he is struggling simply to maintain a job while other teachers are, basically sitting on their duffs in classes because they've got tenure and reading newspapers and not doing any teaching whatsoever.
Yeah.
And this is a sad story, but it's repeated over and over and over. And his take is essentially, I would assume, kind of the same as ours. And you mentioned taking tests and getting that response because you were not willing to fill in the appropriately provided blank, the little oval, with your number 2 lead pencil of pre-selected answers. You realized that there were other answers that were totally and completely outside the box that they wanted to have you think in terms of.
That's right.
And, this is part of my experience as well, because I took one of these tests a number of years ago. It was actually an aptitude test that a friend of mine suggested I take when I was in a situation where I was deciding, nothing is working out for me in academics because, here I am trying to maintain academic standards, and all the system is interested in is for me to teach a set of pre-selected answers, and go about my merry way and let the students go about their merry way as big cogs in a machine.
Yes.
All right. Well, I took this test, and when they were giving back the results, you had to go in to the place where you took the test to get your results. That was being conducted by the U.S. Department of Labor. And, I sat there and waited patiently for my results, and finally the lady said, "Is there a Mr. Farrell here?" At the very end, after everybody else got their results, they finally came to me. And I raised my hand, and she says, "Will you come with us, sir?"
Oh, dear.
Oh, boy, what did I do now, Did my number 2 lead pencil stray beyond the line or something?
Oh, gee.
So they pulled me into the office and handed me my results, and they said, "We would like you to sign a waiver to put your results into a national database." And I said, "Well, why?" And they said, "Well, because statistically these results are not supposed to happen."
Oh.
And I says, "What do you mean?" And they handed me my results, and they said, "Well, you scored in the 99th percentile of all the areas that we tested."
Oh.
And I just looked at them, and I said, "You're joking." And, this to me was not, it wasn't unusual. What it really was an indictment of the whole test that I had just taken.
Yes.
Because, it was one of those, intelligence tests or something, where, again, you're given sort of a pre-selected set of answers and put this block in that hole and all of this nonsense.
Yeah.
The whole idea of measuring intelligence itself comes out of this movement of scientific education that began with Wundt and popularized by Dewey, that you can actually measure the elusive quality of human intelligence by a standardized test. And this is my problem with it. Because, again, what it's doing is managing perceptions, but it's also trying to force you to think in a very linear way. And I'm just like you, GeorgeAnn, and like my friend out in California. I'm a very non-linear thinker.
Oh, yes.
I connect dots in a very, very unusual, odd way. And most people, in my experience, that are gifted people do the same themselves. In other words, the whole thing that makes them intelligent is that they do think outside the box of the pre-selected answer that the establishment is trying to give them.
Absolutely true.
So, it again boils down to perception management and this idea that we have to be robots repeating answers, whether it be the answers of some given religion or some given educational establishment. The end result is the same.
Yes.
And I think we're paying the price for it now.
Oh,
with,
yes.
The people that have backed this educational establishment, the corporate elites and so on, are, in my opinion, in a bit of a panic themselves because they have so put everyone else into a box that they themselves can't think outside the box that they're in.
Yes.
So, this becomes a kind of a vicious circle. They've managed everyone else's perceptions to the point that over the years, their own elite and advisors that they consult for their own actions and activities have been formed in the same box that they themselves have promoted, and therefore they can't think outside of it.
Oh, gee. We're in trouble.
Yeah, we're in trouble.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a very vicious circle, but education is and I'm not trying to paint all people involved in education as professional educators as being part of some vast conspiracy or anything. I don't think they are. In fact, there are many voices within education that do realize the problems of the system and realize that to fix it is going to require some very radical rethinking of the whole structure of it. And many of them point out the problems with these standardized tests as being an example, the prime example, of managing perceptions, when in fact, if we really want to create a society where we can deal with the problems, we have to begin to allow people to do what academics was supposed to be doing all along, and that's freedom of thought.
Yes.
If you can argue your case, then go for it.
Well, Joseph, I've known teachers over the years that have either quit the profession,
yes,
or sometimes on the fly,
yes,
make remarks that communicate to the students that thus and such is not true.
yes,
and it's pitiful.
yes,
the way teachers are treated.
Yes,
and
it is.
It's just it makes them second rate. They
yes.
used to be called professors.
Well, yeah, this is my other big beef, and again, I'm speaking. This is why I would really hope that you're able to interview my friend, because he has been both a professor and a teacher.
Yes.
All right, and he is acutely aware of the difference between the two.
Yes.
I certainly don't disagree with the idea that within public education you have to have very different methods of pedagogy than you do at the collegiate level. I can only speak to my experience as having been a college professor at one point in my life, and that was precisely what you said. Most people in the American Academy now, at that level, view themselves not as professors but as teachers.
Mm-hmm.
But a professor, and this is something that most people do not understand within American culture, a professor is there to profess a discipline. That's why they call them professors. In
Yes.
other words, their responsibility is not to the institution that they're involved with. It is not to the wider culture even. It is to the discipline itself, and to convey with all the force that their intellects can convey all the minutiae and details and ins and outs of a particular discipline to their students. In other words, and I used to say this to my students very explicitly at the beginning of my classes in college, I'm not here to be interested in your emotional life. I am here to profess a discipline, and that means I am not going to talk down to you. You are going to rise up to this.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, here's another issue where they dumb down the class.
Yes.
So kids that haven't caught up.
Yes.
Can catch up.
Yes, exactly.
If they are even able to catch up.
Well, again, this is also a part of this thinking that came out, in my opinion, from Wundt and Dewey. My friend out in California is very adept and skilled as a teacher. He does things now in high school that are considered unusual, but back in the day that I was in high school would have been de rigueur. And that is, they're reading things like Shakespeare plays and having to know who said what and in what act and scene. They're having to understand the ins and outs of rhetorical devices and tropes within poetry. He has them, in other words, actually reading the literature that you would expect to be read at a high school level.
Yes.
So in other words, his approach is, in that sense, very traditional and quote-unquote old-fashioned. But I can remember in the days that I was in high school that, I remember my high school world literature teacher, Mrs. Connor, very vividly, because we had to read The Merchant of Venice and know what character was saying what things in what scene. Her test consisted of nothing but quotations, and you had to identify who was saying what and why. And then we also had to read Dostoevsky's entire novel, Crime and Punishment, which if you've sat down and read any Dostoevsky lately, you'll know that they're a pretty tall drink of water.
Yeah.
But this was being done at a high school level. And in the 20 years that I've had experience personally in education, when I went off to college from South Dakota down south, I was truly amazed at the different educational culture I was stepping into, because it was like these people in college were getting things barely in college that I had studied in high school, and no matter what subject it was, from calculus or literature, it seemed like they were almost 4 years behind.
Yes.
But as it turned out, as I was kind of digging around, what I discovered was that in the state that I grew up, a lot of these educational philosophies were lagging. In other words, they were teaching very traditionally and not up to date with the latest educational theories and so on and so forth. Whereas down south, they were pursuing all of these theories with a vengeance, and the result was, as you say, a dumbed down class.
Yes.
And this is the tragedy of it. People are not unintelligent, but they have been trained, again, perception management, in two ways. Number one, they've been trained to pre-select answers according to some sort of standard academic model of whatever discipline it is that they're being tested on. That's the first part of perception management. But there's a much more insidious part of perception management, and that is the creation in someone's mind that this particular subject is too difficult for me at this level. So in other words, you're creating a perception not only of the subject, you're creating a perception of yourself.
Yes.
And that, to me, is the insidious nature of all of this.
Oh. Well, there are students that are absolutely brilliant.
Yes.
At mechanics, for
yes.
example. But when it comes to language, history, those things, they flunk terribly and are looked upon as being stupid.
Yes.
When they are in no way stupid.
No, of course not. No. And again, this is something I have to give my hearty amens to, because in my time as a professor, I never ran across a stupid student, ever. I ran across a lot of students that thought they were.
Yes, because of the system.
Because of the system, and that thought that they could not handle the level of presentation of material at which I was giving it.
Yes.
And for those who stuck it out, they discovered, yeah, they could. And then they went on to demand the same level of instruction from their other professors. And, you know, ultimately, I think if we're going to turn this around, we have to, I'll be very blunt, we have to get rid of the notion, particularly within the public schools, of two things. We have to get rid of the notion of tenure, and we have to get rid of the notion, and this is really going to probably upset a lot of teachers out there, but the whole idea of credentialization has to go. People have to reorient the priorities that if you are there to teach English or history or mathematics or what have you, that your transcript should show a heavy preponderance of actual class time work in those subjects and not in educational theory or the latest pedagogical techniques and so on, that you do spend your time, you know, and I can't speak for the people that are in that, because my friend can. I mean, he went through the whole process of credentialization, and just the few things that he's told me about the stupidity and childishness of some of the exercises that he was put through just to get a stupid piece of paper so that he could teach in a California public school.
Yeah,
you know, and
here we have a Harvard.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean,
yeah.
Just, oh my gosh.
Yeah, and again, this goes to something else that I think is very, very prevalent in at least in American education. I can't speak to European. The whole process of perception management within this field also seems to me to be promoting a kind of team mentality. You know, you hear so often in corporate circles that you're not a team player or what have you.
Oh, whoopee.
Yeah. In other words, we've had also the idea that we've got to create educational groups.
Yeah.
And do things this way. And everyone, you know, we've set up the whole occult mechanism of degrees and grades. You know, we've transplanted all of that claptrap from the lodge into the school, so that, you know, you get grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, all the way up through high school, and then if you're lucky, you go on to the higher degrees. You know, we've transported this whole mechanism into the field of education, so that the public system kind of looks like the York Rite of Masonry. You know, so and in that, you know, you identify with a group of things. And my problem is it was a rude awakening for me when I went over to Oxford and discovered that they weren't interested in taking roll call. They were not interested in taking class attendance. They handed you a big, thick book called University Examination Decrees and Regulations, which was filled with hundreds of pages of academic arcana and minutiae, and said, here, this is what you have to do to get the degree. And every bit of it, GeorgeAnn, and there were no standardized tests either. I want to stress this. There were no number 2 lead pencils that you took out and filled in your little oval to advance from one stage of the process to another. The only thing they were interested in is mastery of the subject.
Absolutely.
And you had to prove that by being able, and here comes the crucial key thing, by being able to write about it in your own words. Now, you cannot do this, GeorgeAnn. You cannot do this in a standardized test.
Exactly.
Where the answers are pre-selected for you. There is no two ways about it. I think we have to get rid of this idea of credentialization, and if we can't get rid of the idea of standardized tests, then they have to be considerably modified.
Yes.
So that students are required, I don't care if they're majoring in physics, mathematics, biology, genetics, French literature, or ancient Indo-Chinese history, but they have to be able to sit down and write about their subject.
Yes, that makes sense.
And that requires, of course, engagement of the educational profession in evaluating answers. You don't shove them into a computer up in Princeton, New Jersey, and have the computer spit out a number and have it mean anything about a person's aptitude or intelligence or ability.
Absolutely, Joseph. To do otherwise is not fair to the student.
No, of course not. It's denying them their legacy, and that was always the approach that I had when I was in the classroom. That, as a professor, my duty is to transmit the discipline. In other words, it's part of the legacy I was given and am to transmit to them.
Yes.
All right? And, I think the same holds true with my friend. In fact, he's used that word many times to describe his kind of approach, pedagogical approach. And it is a legacy, because if education is to prepare you for mature participation in the long history of cultural development, then yes, that's what it is. And this is the other thing that disturbs me about the perception management of education, and that is that in the view that education and pedagogy are a kind of perception management, if you take that view, then ultimately what you're doing is you are denying people a participation in their cultural legacy.
Yes.
Because what you're doing is you are creating a kind of ersatz pseudo-group mentality.
Yeah.
That you know the answers to you know which oval to fill in a group of pre-selected answers.
Yeah.
And that's a very different thing. And I think, again, this is the reason, having managed everyone's perception of what the right answers are and then the perception of themselves, that we are creating a kind of a false culture. And it's no wonder we have the sort of societal schizophrenia that we do.
Yes.
It won't work. That's why. It hasn't worked for the last 100 years. My word, GeorgeAnn, we got along famously in this country prior to the installation of teacher certification and all that nonsense. And we were producing literate people that could read at a what would now be considered a collegiate level a century ago, and they were doing that in the 9th or 8th grade.
Oh, yes. And, Joseph, I've got some old books that are
I do too.
School books.
Yes, I do too.
And you had to really be able to read.
Yes.
To get through those books.
Yes. Yeah.
Now it's a bunch of hooey.
Well, I go to the other problem. In Europe, you begin learning foreign languages when you are in elementary school.
Yes.
Most Europeans can at least negotiate their way around the English language. All right? In this country, you do not really start to study a foreign language until you are, although that has been changing somewhat in the last few years.
Yeah.
But you still really don't get deeply into a foreign language in this country until junior high at best, and oftentimes high school.
Yes.
So, to me, the language disciplines are to me the most important, because every other discipline is dependent on accuracy of communication.
Oh, yes.
To be transmitted.
Yeah.
So, while the educational system and politicians seem to promote, all of these scientific agendas and no child left behind and all of this nonsense.
Yeah.
What in point of fact they're doing is continuing the dumbing down process that this whole system has led to in the first place. And you again are dealing with managed perceptions.
Yeah.
We have to wake up and realize, and I've said many times in this series, don't let in my comments on religion, don't let a book do your thinking for you. Think for yourself.
Yes.
And I would say the same thing about education. Don't let an educational pedagogical textbook of methodology determine how you think about what you should be doing in the classroom. Unfortunately, The teachers, this is the other insidious part of this whole system. The teachers in the system have to prepare their students to regurgitate pre-selected answers on tests.
Yes.
See? So in other words, they cannot really freely teach.
Well, that is absolutely true, Joseph. And the certification process, there are born teachers that are just born to it. They're good at it.
Yes.
And
yes.
they love it.
Yes.
But they can't pass a certification. And yet you've got some dumb a-hole out here that
yeah.
passes the certification and couldn't teach a
yes.
rock.
Yes, yes. I have seen this myself. I suspect that my friend has numerous horror stories, and I'm really hoping that you'll be able to do some series with him, because GeorgeAnn, at one point just before I quit college teaching, I actually wrote an 8-page letter to the governor of Oklahoma informing him of the answers I had been given on some of my history tests.
Yeah.
And I would usually start my history classes out by giving a test to see what incoming students knew. And I will tell you that without exception, most of the stupidest answers I had on historical problems were from education students, from people that were going to go out and teach.
Oh boy!
I had the Battle of Waterloo being fought in 1803. I had the Treaty of Versailles, which was incidentally spelled Versigh, being signed in 1914. When the war is beginning. It's over and over. I had the Army of Northern Virginia being commanded by General Ulysses S. Grant.
Oh my!
All of this. The answers were so inane. They were so stupid. But you could see that what they were trying to do was guess at answers on the basis of the context that I was providing them. But they were coming up with nonsense.
Yeah.
Because they had not been taught the content.
Yes, content.
Content. Again, it's substance versus form. And whenever you have perception management, this is so crucial a point. If you study the technique of it, what you have always is an emphasis on form and a misdirection of perception into a receptacle of form that resembles the genuine article. This is so crucial.
Oh, Joseph.
Yeah, it's breathtaking.
Yes, it is.
The damage that has been done by the educational theorists to education in this country is almost overwhelming and mind-boggling.
Well, who are the educational theorists?
Right now, I wouldn't know. My friend would be, I was so disgusted. I haven't been in a classroom, GeorgeAnn, since 1998, I think, on a steady basis. So I've lost all touch with it. But I can tell you from just my one brief experience in trying to get my own certification that I was so disgusted at what I was, quote-unquote, being taught that after 2 days I simply quit. Because I was being treated like a 6-year-old.
Oh, dear.
For one thing, there is within education, there are manuals or style manuals of how to reference or cite a source, all right?
Yes.
Within the educational profession, they use a source. 2 style manuals are prevalent, and one is the Associated Press style manual. The other one is the Modern Language Association manual, all right?
Mm-hmm.
And if, for example, my books, how they're footnoted.
Yes.
I use a kind of a modified version of what's called the Chicago Manual of Style. It is the only way, in my opinion, that you should cite any source, because in my particular discipline of theology, you have to cite a lot of ancient sources.
Yes.
And there is a way to do this so that someone can, by reading your footnote, go directly in a library to the precise book and look up on the precise page, and in some cases even find where on the page to look for that particular citation.
Yes.
All right? But in other words, when you cite, I cite the author, I cite the title of the work, I cite the publisher, if it has a publisher. I cite the year that it was published, in other words, the edition I'm citing from, and the page.
Yes.
All right? In the modern system of documenting a reference that education students learn, they think that merely citing the author's name and a page number is sufficient.
Oh my gosh.
And then oftentimes these are inserted as parenthetical comments right in the main text itself. So in other words, you're not even reading a footnote.
Oh dear.
So you're it's just hideous. It's a kind of a half citation, in other words.
Oh.
And when I was studying for my certification, I challenged the professor. I said, I have a PhD from the University of Oxford, and I can tell you, I pulled him aside, and I said, I can tell you that if any of your students were in my classes using this method of citation to cite references and sources, I would hand the paper back. I don't care if it is the accepted method of the Modern Language Association or the Associated Press, and I would tell them I am only accepting in the Chicago Manual of Style, because I want all the details, not a half-assed, half-baked, partially done method of referencing. And that's what they're teaching teachers.
Oh my God.
It would never fly, ever fly, in a European university. Ever. Now, that may be changing in Europe right now. I don't know. I've heard some horror stories actually coming out of some of the European universities that are adopting this American corporate model of higher education. And it scares me to death that they've bought into this claptrap and nonsense and not maintained the standards. Because essentially, GeorgeAnn, the Chicago Manual of Referencing comes from those European universities. It's simply a kind of a standardized version of what you were expected to do when referencing sources in a European university.
Does any of this have to do with religious bias?
What do you mean? I'm not quite I think I get what you're saying, but I need to know a little bit more.
Yeah, I think you get what I'm saying. This travesty, this ridiculous, the whole thing, does it have anything to do with a religious bias?
In a cultural sense, I think it does. American culture, the American civil religion, in other words, what passes for
Christianity,
for religion in this country, is so utterly cut off from any real historical connection with any real historical form of Christianity, be it Lutheranism or Anglicanism or Presbyterianism or Roman Catholicism, what have you. The religion in this country is kind of a made up for America as we go along sort of thing. In other words, there is a suspicion of history and tradition within American religion, and it shows up in a similar way, I think, in the way that American culture has structured its educational system. You don't really get anything close to the European experience of education unless you go to a place like Harvard or Yale or Princeton. And even there, you're not really given a fully European experience because it's been infected with this notion of scientific education, standardized tests, and so on and so forth. So, I think you're right. But I wouldn't say so much that it's a religious bias. I think it's a cultural bias. It's a bias against the deep legacy and history that lies behind these disciplines. And, my approach has always been, and this, again, I think is another telling comment on one of the failings of the educational system, because my approach has always been, if you want to understand a subject, even a subject as difficult to understand as physics, what you do is study its history.
Yes. And
you study, and this is the other bias that the American system has, that again is part of perception management. We have in this country textbooks, right?
Yes.
But I defy you to open many of these textbooks and find any texts In other words, in this country, you read about Plato, you read about Aristotle, you read about Thomas Aquinas, you read about Goethe and Dante and Schiller and Shakespeare and so on.
Yes.
In Europe, you read them.
Yes.
You
Yes.
don't read about them. So in other words, we have an emphasis in this country, particularly in the sciences, that I find very distressing. In the sciences, you sit down and you read a physics textbook that summarizes the development of physics. But why not sit down and read James Clerk Maxwell, and read Albert Einstein, and read E.T. Whittaker, and read Arthur Eddington? In other words, read the papers that these men actually wrote that changed the science that you're studying. Read their actual words.
Yes.
Rather than what someone else tells you they said.
Oh, yes.
You know, and this was always I know it's my friend's approach. You know, he doesn't have them reading a bunch of textbooks about Shakespeare and so on. He has them reading them. You know, perish the thought. You know, but this is my point. And when you're reading, this is the whole problem with perception management again. Because when you're reading a secondary source, you're reading someone else's perceptions about. All right?
Yes.
Rather than reading the primary source and forming your own perceptions of what is being said. So again, you're being molded into a perception of things by depending on this sort of secondary or even tertiary transmission of the deposit of knowledge.
Oh, my goodness. Well, it makes sense. I mean,
of course.
My gosh, Joseph.
Now, there's a place, of course, for reading the secondary sources, because there are classic secondary sources. But in order to have appreciation for what they say and how they evaluate the primary sources, you have to know the primary sources.
Yes.
So in other words, you know, we have turned everything, in my opinion, upside down in this quest to make education and the transmission of the deposit of human knowledge scientific. It isn't. We might as well get it through our thick heads that education, like every other genuinely deep human experience, has to have genuine human interaction.
Yes.
And it cannot simply be evaluated on the basis of standardized tests and numbers. There is a transcendent quality to it that eludes all of that. I'm not saying there's no place for no tests or any of that, you know, certainly not. But, again, you know, I was asked once to give a multiple choice test because I was always giving essay tests,
yes.
you know, making the students write the answers.
Yes.
And give their own opinions and argue their opinions. I was asked once to give a multiple choice examination, so I finally relented. I gave a multiple choice examination. It consisted of one question and 26 different possible answers, one for each letter of the alphabet, each answer varying only slightly in its wording from every other answer. All right?
Yes.
And only one student, as he was handing in his exam papers, said, "Dr. Farrell, can I talk with you privately?" And I said, "Sure." And he proceeds to tell me that none of the answers are correct.
Yeah.
And that he couldn't complete the exam because of that.
Oh.
He got the A.
Oh.
Because none of the answers were correct.
Oh, my goodness.
And none of the answers, additionally, allowed any student to argue why they weren't correct.
Oh.
So in other words, it was a little lesson to the students, be extremely suspicious of all of this notion of standardized tests, because in taking them, you are surrendering your own intelligence, your own ability to perceive and argue and think critically.
Yes. Oh. Well, critical thinking is something that is fast disappearing in education. And
yes,
it's very sad, Joseph.
Yes. Yes, it is. It is. It is. You know, if you are attempting to teach both genuine primary source content in a discipline, in the American system,
Yes.
and to teach critical system about it. The system itself is set up to inhibit you from doing so. And this is the crime. This is the perception management and social engineering that's going on.
Mm.
And we're paying the price.
Well, you know, it's interesting. High school students kind of have the air about them that, boy, they know everything.
Yes.
And it's kind of funny because when they hit their 40s, a lot of that changes.
It's part of another problem that I think is going on with the social engineering and perception management that's taking place, and that is there has been such a dumbing down that you have two attitudes that have been promoted, and in my opinion, promoted somewhat deliberately. And that is the attitude, we know everything.
Yeah.
And number two, we're bored.
Yeah.
And this, I can't count how many times I stepped into a classroom and looked out over the assembling students for the first time, the first day of a class.
Yeah.
And how many of them conveyed sheer boredom. Boredom. That this was another ordeal to get through, and, but this is the problem. The reason the students are bored is that they are being talked down to. They're being treated as unintelligent cogs,
yes,
incapable of any genuine thought or argument of their own.
Absolutely.
And I have, like I say, I have never run into a dumb group of students in that sense. I've run into a lot of students that were poorly educated.
Yes.
But very, very seldom stupid. Their answers may have been stupid, but that wasn't their fault. That was the system's fault.
Yeah.
And perish the thought that we should inculcate the perception, hey, I can do this on my own. I have a mind, and I can trust my mind and read things on my own.
Well, that right there is so important to convey to a student, to trust their mind and that they can do this. Oh my gosh, it's important for their self-image.
Yes, it is,
and for their the next step that they take in education.
Well, why would we expect, GeorgeAnn? Why would we expect if we adopt a materialistic, Wundtian, Dewey-esque view of humanity and of the human intelligence as nothing but an accidental chemical process going on in the brain?
Yeah.
Why would we expect students who are treated and subjected to a system like that to develop any sense of self-worth or of their sense of their own innate intellectual ability to handle difficult topics if we are spoon-feeding them and pre-packaging answers for them to fill in with their number 2 lead pencils?
Yeah.
Why would we expect anything else to result from that system?
Well, that's why I think it's intentional that they're doing this to the students.
Oh, I do too. And that makes, and there are so many teachers out there, I know, my friend is one of them, that are swimming against this grain.
Yes.
Or trying to swim against this grain. But the system, again, it at times is so overwhelming because you are called into meetings where nothing is accomplished other than a fantastically huge waste of time and put through a bunch of intellectually mind-numbing exercises of groupthink.
Yeah.
That, even the teachers are subjected to this nonsense.
Oh, gee. Well, how does it come down that the teachers are subjected to it?
Well, like I say, in the whole process of certification, I was in a program where literally you were involved in a bunch of groupthink activities that were of mind-numbing, kindergarten-esque childishness.
Well, like, give us an example.
Oh, golly. It's so hard to describe. In my case, we were supposed to bring in one day and a bunch of our personal items and effects to kind of give people a handle on the sort of personality that we were and say a few words about ourselves. Well, what this effectively did, GeorgeAnn, was you spent the whole day playing show and tell.
Oh, gee. Oh. Yeah.
And this was for credit.
Oh.
Now, GeorgeAnn, my approach has always been quite the reverse. I don't particularly care to impose my personality on anyone. I certainly try to, I don't talk in my books about what I'm thinking and how my day is and what sort of objects I have in my apartment and so on and so forth, and no one would be interested in it.
Right.
So in other words, it's also, in a certain sense, it's trying to teach you to impose the banal about yourself on others, to avoid talking about anything significant.
Oh, very good. Yes.
And I guarantee you, every teacher out there that's gone through certification has gone through something similar.
Oh, dear. That's so childish, so
yes, absolutely. Of
backward.
Course it is. Of course it is. Of course it is.
Oh, my
of course
goodness.
it is. And this. I'm not trying to say that I was impersonal to my students by any. I was deeply concerned for their well-being. But that concern manifested itself by maintaining as rigorously as I could, under the circumstances, a degree of genuinely collegiate level of professorship.
Yes.
And, like I say, there are literally hundreds of teachers out there caught in this miserable system trying to do the very same thing. But we're never going to fix it until we realize that it's this whole approach, this whole Wundtian, Dewey-esque, I forget the name of the corporation that handles all these standardized tests up there in Princeton, New Jersey, and feeds all these answers through their computers. But, this whole monopoly just simply has to be broken if it's going to be fixed. Throwing more money at it, I don't care if you're dummy crooks or Republicans, throwing more money at it isn't going to fix the problem.
That's true. That's true, Joe.
The problem isn't money. The problem isn't money. The problem is the way the system is structured.
Yes.
That money could be used, we could get rid of about 50% of the administrators.
Oh, yes.
Hello?
Yes.
What happened there?
I don't know.
Oh. Well, we could get rid of administrators in this whole mess.
Yes.
Because that was the other shock to my system when I went to Oxford. The administration of the university, in other words, the day-to-day mechanics of running the university, is run by the faculty.
Yeah.
You don't have, at least when I went there, you didn't have this huge administrative structure. It was the faculty that ran it. You didn't have a professional bureaucracy of academic deans and deans of students and professors or presidents of this and alumni associations of that when it gets right down to it is just added icing on the educational cake.
Yeah.
The everything was being held closely in the hands of the people actually entrusted with conveying whatever deposit of knowledge in whatever discipline they were lecturers in. It was up to them to administer the day-to-day mechanics of running the university and the colleges.
Oh.
It's a totally different system. And here's the problem. Talk about another indictment of the American system. Oxford is not an accredited university.
Oh, my goodness.
So you come to this country with a degree from that institution, and the first thing that you have to fight in this country is the fact that it's not accredited. The oldest university with a track record of academics is not accredited, and perish the thought they ever should be.
Yes.
Because then when they do that, when they take that step, they have to answer to an educational bureaucracy established in this country that is set up to tell you how and what you must have on hand to even be accredited.
Oh.
And in the bottom line is the educational institutions in this country are failing. I don't care if you're talking about Stanford, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, they are failing.
Yes, they are. Yes, they are. And fewer students can afford the tuitions.
Why would you go to them, GeorgeAnn? Why would you go to them?
Oh.
I was so disgusted by the time I had finished my master's degree at I wanted to be challenged.
Yes.
But in every classroom I stepped into, my professors were treating me as if I were in the 8th grade.
Oh.
Because that's all they knew. It wasn't their fault. That's all they knew of a level of instruction.
Oh.
When they would come into a class, they'd open a textbook and start lecturing from the textbook. In other words, they would do a book report.
Yeah.
They couldn't come in and lecture on their subject without notes. And to me, if you're going to be a professor and stand in front of a classroom, you'd better know your discipline well enough to know that you might be caught someday without your textbook or your notes and have to do it extempore.
Yeah.
If you can't do it to that level, then you shouldn't be in front of a classroom.
I agree. I agree.
And again, that's perception management. It's been so managed that even the teachers have a certain expectation of what it is they're supposed to do in class, even at the college level.
Oh.
Even at the college level.
There's
little understanding anymore of the academic lecture in the grand style. There are very few Noam Chomskys left that can get in front of a classroom and literally bewitch people and hold them spellbound by the sheer eloquence and power of their delivery and their knowledge of the content.
Yes.
And that, to me, is what education is about. And there are teachers out there that can do that, but again, like I say, they are the exception in this system, and they're swimming upstream.
Yeah.
Because the other thing that happens when you've created a culture of mediocrity in education is if you have, I think again of my friend here, if you have that level of presentation and presence in the classroom, then you're a threat to all the mediocrities that surround you.
Absolutely. And they will work.
Against you.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Oh.
So again, we are rewarding mediocrity and we are punishing excellence, not only in our students, but in our teachers. And that, again, that's perception management.
Yes.
Thank you, Wilhelm Wundt and John Dewey.
Oh. Well, Joseph, my goodness, this has been very informative, as all of our audio sessions together are.
Well, thank you, GeorgeAnn. I hope we'll do some more, and I hope we can get my friend on for some interviews, because I think education is something near and dear to everybody's heart, and it is all part of this, social engineering scheme.
Yeah. Well, I can remember first grade, and it was at a Catholic school, and I ran away.
Yeah,
I ran away.
Yeah.
A little boy, the nuns believed they caught him in a lie, and they took him into a room and burned his lips with Ohio blue tip matches.
Oh my.
And I was horrified, and I ran away.
Yeah.
And I had a very difficult time in school. I did not like school.
Well, same here. I was bored.
Yeah.
I was bored. And, and I say that having grown up in South Dakota, which at that time, and still does, have a very good public educational school system. A bunch of Germans and Swedes, running it, and that's what you get. But nonetheless, I remember all throughout school, up until junior high, when I was put in junior high into accelerated mathematics programs and some other accelerated programs, because at that time in South Dakota anyway, they believed in skipping grades. If you were bored, then they'll just skip you and put you in a higher grade.
Yeah.
But, they don't do that so much anymore, and I can understand part of the logic, but again, it's this idea of grades. Why really do we even need them? Why can't we have education consisting of substance and delivery of substance, and at whatever age you are able to deliver it, then go right ahead.
Yes, absolutely.
It's not a slight on anyone else.
Oh. Well, another time in high school, I broke my leg, and I had to stay home, and a new science workbook came out.
Yes.
And some of the students brought this new science workbook to me and said, you have to do the lessons. Well, over the weekend, I completed the whole damn book.
Yeah.
And I turned it in, and I was given a failing grade because I didn't turn it in lesson by lesson by lesson.
Yes, exactly.
I turned in the whole thing. It was completed. It was done. And
so you were punished for going above and beyond the measure.
Yes.
Exactly.
And when other kids were at the football games and stuff, I would spend time in the library, and I would check out 10, 12 books on a particular subject. And then when, particularly history class and civics, I would argue with the teacher from a different viewpoint.
Yeah.
And that quickly got me to be in a little room off of the principal's office.
Yeah.
And they didn't want me in the classroom around the other kids.
Yep.
And it was the most miserable time. School was...
This is something that I've noticed too, and maybe my friend has noticed this, but there is a certain kind of student that is so bored they'll go out and study on their own. I mean, this is how I became interested in physics, because in the 7th grade, I was bored in the science classes, so I'd go into the library and I'd check out books. Well, one of the books in the library, in Patrick Henry Junior High Library there in Sioux Falls, was a book by Albert Einstein and Leopold Enfelt called The Evolution of Physics, and it was a kind of a popular historical treatment of physics, and I devoured that book. I checked it out so many times and read and reread, and that I was fascinated with this, and a lot of students, I think, are in the same boat. They get bored in school, so they end up teaching themselves. And by the time I got to college, and I think I could probably say the same for my friend, one of the reasons that we decided to go to Oxford was precisely because we were fed up at the PhD level with having to go into classes, have our name ticked off in an attendance roll call book, and all of this nonsense. We wanted to read our subject.
Yes.
And that's what they call it there at Oxford. They don't call it majoring in a subject. They call it reading for a degree. You read in your subject. You read as much as you can.
Yes.
So even the nomenclature that is used to describe the process is entirely different. And we've got to get back to this. I don't care what the discipline is, if it's physics, biology, literature, what have you. We've got to get back to this notion that reading the primary sources of whatever it is you're studying from a very early age is crucial. There's no reason for students that are young not to be reading the classics when in the 19th century that was the norm for young students.
Absolutely.
Not a textbook written at a 3rd grade level.
Yeah.
But actual words from the actual people that wrote them.
Oh. Yes, absolutely, Joseph. I agree with you. It needs to change. It really does.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Because we have some long-term problems right now, not only in the world but in this country. And you look at the product of the educational system now.
Yes.
In 30 to 50 years, we're going to have doctors and nurses that won't know anatomy. We're going to have airplane mechanics that won't know how to fix a jet engine. And, we're going to have teachers of English that don't know how to spell.
Yeah.
All of this.
Yes.
And it needs to be fixed. But, the surgery is going to be radical. Throwing more money at it at the same old system isn't going to fix it. I'm sorry, Mr. Bush. I'm sorry, Mr. Obama. It's not going to fix it.
Well, I agree with that. Changing gears just for a minute. Mm-hmm. What do you think about the riots that are taking place in Egypt?
Well, I think you're looking at a phenomenon, at least in Egypt's case, that is very, very difficult to fasten onto. In part, I think you may be looking at something that is being driven behind the scenes by radical elements.
Yeah.
But by the same token, Egypt is a very, very sophisticated country. And, the Egyptians are, by and large, a fairly educated people. And I think you're looking also at the natural human longing. You're looking at, in a certain sense, a kind of Egyptian version of Tiananmen Square.
Yes.
Because Hosni Mubarak, of course, comes out of that whole revolution that dates back to the overthrow of King Farouk and the installation of Gamal Abdel Nasser, and then later, of course, of Anwar Sadat, who took his place when Nasser died, and then, of course, Mubarak is in the same revolutionary party that took control of Egypt after the fall of King Farouk. Mm-hmm. So you're looking at, I think, in part, a natural human desire of an educated, literate people to manage and be responsible for their own affairs. You're looking at people that want freedom. But again, like I say, I think there may be the strong possibility of some radical elements that are hiding behind the scenes, perhaps directing some of this.
Yes.
So it's very, very difficult to fasten onto. I think you're going to see that sort of thing spreading. Mm-hmm. China had its brush with Tiananmen Square, but it's still there. I mean, it'll bubble over again, and you can't take intelligent, literate peoples like the Egyptians or the Chinese and expect them forever to be subservient to a minority elite that dictates all the country's policies.
Right.
You just can't do it. And it hasn't ever worked in human history. Sooner or later the elites are going to wake up and realize that they're cutting their own throats by not unleashing this tremendous human potential of creativity.
Yes.
I don't care what its creativity in, if it's in literature or the arts or music or what have you. The sciences, we are cutting our own throats at a stage of world history that really boggles the imagination. We need right now to unleash this store of creativity all over the world. I don't care if it's just Egypt or China, but literally everywhere. It needs to be unleashed. And, the solutions that will pop up, I think, will be rather breathtaking. So it's something to watch.
Well, there's quite a few countries that are rioting.
Yes, I know.
And it is a pathetic thing, Joseph, when prices get so high that people cannot afford to feed themselves and their families.
Well, I think part of that is deliberate. And the rioting, you see, the problem is that that aspect of it is being directed against the wrong people.
Yeah.
If you're going to riot, against the people responsible for that sort of thing, then you need to go to Zurich and Basel and London and so on, and riot.